Let me be direct with you about something most relationship advice completely misses. If you're a woman over 50 who's been in a long-term relationship, you've probably noticed a shift. Maybe it's subtle, maybe it's glaring, but somewhere along the way, intimacy changed. Not just the frequency, but the quality, the initiation, the entire energy around it. And if you're being honest with yourself, you've felt a knot in your stomach wondering if he's still attracted to you, if you're still desirable, if maybe you've somehow failed to keep things interesting. You lie awake some nights, replaying interactions, analyzing his body language, wondering what happened to the man who couldn't keep his hands off you. You've probably even Googled things at 2 in the morning, looking for answers, feeling a mix of frustration and loneliness that you'd never admit to your friends. Because admitting it feels like admitting defeat. And you didn't come this far in life to feel defeated by something as fundamental as connection with your partner. Here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. That anxiety you're carrying, that feeling that you need to somehow become different or do something radically new to fix this, it's based on a complete misunderstanding of what's actually happening in his mind and body. The bedroom dynamic between a woman and a man over 60 isn't struggling because of what you think it is. It's not about your body. It's not about your technique. It's not even really about sex in the way you've been conditioned to think about it. What's happening is so much deeper and so much simpler than that. And once you understand it, everything shifts. Not just your approach, but your entire emotional state around intimacy. You stop performing. You stop second-guessing. You stop feeling like you're auditioning for a role you've already earned. The reason most women never figure this out is because men over 60 are dealing with a perfect storm of biological changes, social conditioning, and psychological barriers that they literally don't have the vocabulary to express. Think about the generation of men we're talking about. These are men who were raised in an era where showing vulnerability was weakness, where talking about feelings was feminine, where sex was supposed to be straightforward and uncomplicated. They were taught that real men just know what to do, that desire should be automatic, that performance is everything. Now add to that the very real physical changes happening in their bodies. Testosterone levels declining, blood flow issues, medications that interfere with function, energy levels that aren't what they used to be, and perhaps most significantly, a deep unspoken fear that if they can't perform the way they used to, they're somehow less of a man. What men over 60 really want in the bedroom isn't wild experimentation or pornographic fantasy fulfillment. It's not about positions or frequency or living up to some idealized version of sexuality that never really existed in the first place. What they want, desperately, is permission to be human. They want intimacy without the pressure of performance. They want connection without the scoreboard. They want to feel desired not for what they can do, but for who they are. But here's the devastating part. They have absolutely no idea how to ask for this. Because asking for it feels like admitting failure. It feels like confessing that they're not the man they used to be. And for a generation raised on stoicism and self-reliance, that admission feels impossible. So instead of communicating, they withdraw. They avoid initiation because they're terrified of not being able to follow through. They create distance because distance protects them from the vulnerability of being seen as inadequate. They might make jokes about being too old or too tired, or they might just quietly stop reaching for you in the night. And you, interpreting this through your own lens of insecurity, assume it's about your desirability. You assume he's lost interest. You assume you need to somehow become more enticing, more adventurous, more of whatever you think you're lacking. And this creates a cycle where both of you are trapped in your own silent suffering, neither one able to bridge the gap because neither one understands what the other actually needs. But what the majority of women don't realize is that this entire dynamic is rooted in a biological and psychological reality that has almost nothing to do with their partnership and everything to do with how men process aging, masculinity, and sexual identity. When you understand the mechanics of what's happening in his body and mind, when you see the invisible weight he's carrying, everything changes. Because suddenly, you're not taking his behavior personally. You're not making it about your worth. You're seeing him clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. And from that clarity comes a completely different approach. An approach that doesn't just restore intimacy, but deepens it in ways you probably thought were no longer possible at this stage of life. If you want to stop guessing, stop feeling anxious, and stop interpreting his silence as rejection, stay with me. Because what I'm about to share with you is the map to his inner world that he can't give you himself. Not because he doesn't want to, but because he genuinely doesn't have the tools to articulate it. This isn't about learning new tricks or techniques. This is about understanding the fundamental shift that happens in masculine sexuality after 60, and how you, as a woman who understands this, become the exact person he's been hoping you'd be all along. Someone who sees him, accepts him, and knows how to create the kind of intimacy that makes him feel like the man he wants to be, not the man he fears he's becoming. The biological reality of what happens to men after 60 is something our culture desperately wants to ignore. But understanding it is the key to everything. Let's start with testosterone, because this is where most of the confusion begins. Between the ages of 30 and 70, men lose approximately 1% of their testosterone per year. That might not sound like much, but by the time a man reaches 60, he's operating with significantly less of the hormone that drove his sexual desire, his energy levels, his confidence, and his sense of vitality for most of his adult life. Testosterone isn't just about sexual function. It's about drive, motivation, the feeling of being capable and strong. When it declines, everything declines with it. But here's what makes this so psychologically devastating for men. The decline is gradual enough that they don't wake up one day and realize what's happening. Instead, they just slowly start to feel like a shadow of who they used to be. And they have no framework for understanding why. Now, layer on top of that the physical mechanics of arousal. Younger men can think about sex and have an immediate physical response. It's automatic, almost involuntary. For men over 60, arousal requires more direct stimulation, more time, more mental focus, and more favorable physical conditions. Blood flow isn't what it used to be. Medications for blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, and depression all interfere with erectile function. And the fear of not being able to perform becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because anxiety literally shuts down the physiological processes required for arousal. Imagine for a moment being in a situation where the thing that used to define your masculinity, the thing that used to be effortless, now requires concentration, planning, and often pharmaceutical assistance. And imagine that every time you think about initiating intimacy, there's a voice in your head asking what happens if your body doesn't cooperate. That's the reality most men over 60 are living with, and they're living with it in complete silence. But the physical changes are only half the story. The psychological weight is what really creates the distance you're feeling. Men of this generation were socialized to believe that their value as men was directly tied to their ability to provide, protect, and perform. Sexual performance was one of the few areas where masculinity was measured in a clear, undeniable way. Either you could or you couldn't. There was no middle ground, no room for nuance. And now, in a stage of life where so many other markers of masculine identity are already shifting, retirement, physical strength, relevance in a changing world, the bedroom becomes this loaded space where every encounter feels like a test. A test he's not confident he can pass. So rather than risk failing, rather than face the humiliation of his body not responding the way he wants it to, he simply opts out. He stops initiating. He stays up later than you. He creates reasons to be tired. He turns his back and pretends to sleep. And every single time he does this, he's not rejecting you. He's protecting himself from the unbearable vulnerability of being seen as inadequate. Think about it like this. Imagine you had a skill that defined you your entire adult life. Something you were good at. Something that made you feel competent and valuable. And then imagine that skill slowly started to fail you. Not because you stopped caring, but because your body just stopped cooperating. And imagine that every time you tried to use that skill and failed, someone you loved was watching, potentially judging, potentially disappointed. You'd start to avoid situations where that skill was required, wouldn't you? Not because you didn't care about the person watching, but because the shame of failing in front of them felt unbearable. That's what's happening in your bedroom. His withdrawal isn't about desire for you. It's about fear of failure in front of you. And the tragic irony is that while he's pulling away to protect his ego, you're interpreting that distance as rejection of your worth, creating a chasm between you that has nothing to do with how either of you actually feels about the other. Here's the part that brings relief to almost every woman I work with. The quality of intimacy he actually craves at this age has almost nothing to do with the athletic, performance-driven sexuality of younger years. What he wants, on the deepest level, is to feel accepted exactly as he is right now. Not as he was at 40. Not as he wishes he could be, but as he actually is, with all the limitations and changes that come with aging. He wants to know that you still see him as a man, even when his body doesn't respond the way it used to. He wants physical closeness without the pressure of an erection being the barometer of success. He wants to touch you and be touched by you without the entire encounter building toward a specific outcome that he's not sure he can deliver. He wants intimacy to be about connection, not performance, about presence, not prowess. But he has absolutely no idea how to communicate this, because communicating it feels like admitting defeat in the one arena where men are supposed to just instinctively know what to do. The other element that almost no one talks about is the emotional component of desire for men at this age. When men are younger, desire is often purely physical. Visual stimulation, opportunity, physical sensation. These things alone can trigger arousal. But as men age and testosterone declines, desire becomes far more emotional and psychological. He needs to feel respected. He needs to feel valued. He needs to feel like he still matters in your world. If there's tension in the relationship, if he feels criticized or unappreciated, if he senses that you're frustrated with him, his desire shuts down completely. Not because he's punishing you, but because emotional safety becomes a prerequisite for vulnerability. And sex at this age requires profound vulnerability. He can't perform on command. He can't will his body to cooperate. He needs the conditions to be right emotionally before anything physical is even possible. And if he's walking around feeling like he's disappointing you, like he's not measuring up, like you're unhappy with him, his body will simply refuse to cooperate, no matter how much he might want it to. This is why so many women experience their partners becoming more withdrawn, more irritable, more distant during this phase. It's not that he's become a different person. It's that he's carrying an enormous weight of shame and inadequacy that he can't articulate. And that weight is affecting every aspect of how he shows up in the relationship. The less confident he feels about his sexual function, the more he withdraws emotionally, because emotional intimacy leads to physical intimacy, and physical intimacy leads to the possibility of failure. So he creates distance as a form of self-protection, never realizing that the distance itself is destroying the very thing he still wants: connection with you. Now that you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, the question becomes, what do you do with this knowledge? Because understanding alone doesn't shift the dynamic. Action does. But not the action most women default to. Not trying harder to seduce him. Not initiating more aggressively. Not suggesting new things to try, or wearing different lingerie, or any of the surface-level attempts to spark desire. Those approaches actually make things worse, because they increase the performance pressure he's already drowning in. What shifts everything is when you become the woman who understands what he can't say, and creates the environment where he can finally exhale, where intimacy stops being a test and becomes a sanctuary. The first posture of high value is removing all outcome-based expectations from physical intimacy. This sounds simple, but it requires a complete reframe of how you approach connection. Instead of intimacy being a linear path toward a specific goal, you make it about presence and pleasure in the moment, regardless of where it leads. You initiate physical closeness with absolutely no agenda. You touch him, hold him, kiss him, with zero expectation that it needs to escalate into anything more. You create moments of physical connection throughout the day that have nothing to do with sex. A hand on his shoulder when you walk past, sitting close to him on the couch. A long hug that doesn't rush toward anything else. What this does is rebuild his association between physical touch and safety, rather than physical touch and performance anxiety. He starts to let his guard down because he's not constantly bracing for the moment where he'll be expected to deliver something he's not sure he can provide. When you're in bed together, you make it explicitly clear through your words and your energy that an erection is not required for intimacy to be satisfying. You tell him directly that what you want most is to feel close to him, to experience pleasure with him, to connect with him, and that there are countless ways to do that beyond traditional intercourse. You guide his hands. You show him what feels good. You vocalize your pleasure when he touches you in ways that have nothing to do with penetration. You make it clear that his value as a lover isn't determined by one specific body part functioning in one specific way. And here's what happens when you do this consistently. The performance anxiety that's been shutting down his desire starts to dissolve, because suddenly the stakes are gone. Suddenly intimacy is something he can succeed at, regardless of what his body does or doesn't do. And ironically, when the pressure disappears, function often returns, because anxiety was the primary thing blocking it in the first place. The second posture is building his emotional safety outside the bedroom, because that's where desire actually begins for men at this age. You become the woman who sees his value beyond what he provides or performs. You notice the things he does well. You express appreciation for who he is, not just what he does for you. You create moments of lightness and laughter instead of criticism and complaint. You make home a place where he feels respected and valued, not judged and found wanting. This isn't about becoming subservient or ignoring legitimate issues in the relationship. It's about understanding that a man who feels diminished in his everyday life cannot show up with desire and confidence in intimate moments. His emotional state and his sexual function are inseparably linked at this age. When he feels valued, seen, and respected, when he feels like he still matters in your world, his body responds. Not because you've manipulated him, but because you've created the conditions where vulnerability feels safe. The third element is initiating conversations about intimacy from a place of curiosity rather than frustration. Instead of avoiding the topic or bringing it up in moments of conflict, you choose a calm moment and you ask him directly what would make physical intimacy more enjoyable for him right now. You tell him that you've been thinking about how intimacy changes as we get older, and you want to understand what he needs to feel good in his body and connected to you. You make it clear that this isn't about criticism or disappointment, but about both of you figuring out what works at this stage of life. And here's the critical part. When he starts to open up, even a little, you don't react with judgment or hurt. You listen. You validate. You make it safe for him to be honest. Most men have never had a conversation like this in their entire lives. They've never had a partner who could hold space for their vulnerability around sexuality without making it about her own insecurity. When you become that woman, you become irreplaceable to him in a way that transcends physical attraction. What happens when you embody these three postures consistently is something most women don't expect. He doesn't just become more physically affectionate. He becomes more emotionally present, more attentive, more engaged in the relationship overall. Because what you've done is lift the crushing weight of shame and inadequacy he's been carrying. You've shown him that he doesn't have to be a certain way to be loved and desired by you, that his value isn't contingent on performance, that aging doesn't make him less worthy of intimacy and connection. And when a man feels that level of acceptance from his partner, when he experiences that depth of emotional safety, something shifts in how he sees you. You stop being the person he needs to hide from. You become the person he wants to be vulnerable with, the person he wants to be close to. Not because you've performed some elaborate seduction, but because you've given him something far more valuable. You've given him permission to be human. The hidden benefit of this approach that almost no one talks about is how it transforms your own experience of intimacy. When you stop making his desire or his function about your desirability, when you stop performing or trying to manage his response, you actually get to experience pleasure and connection for what they are. You stop being in your head analyzing whether he's attracted to you. You stop watching for signs of his arousal as proof of your worth. You get to be present in your own body, experiencing your own pleasure, connected to another human being you care about. The irony is that by releasing your attachment to a specific outcome, you often end up with more fulfilling intimacy than you've had in years, because both of you are finally free from the prison of expectation and performance. Both of you get to just be together, imperfect, aging, human, and more deeply connected than youth and flawless function ever allowed you to be. Here's the truth that changes everything. The intimacy available to you after 60, when you understand what's actually happening and respond with wisdom instead of insecurity, is deeper and more meaningful than anything that came before. Not because the sex is more frequent or more athletic, but because it's more honest, more vulnerable, more rooted in genuine connection rather than performance and validation. You become the woman who knows that real desire at this age isn't about bodies that look a certain way or perform a certain way. It's about two people who choose each other, see each other, and create space for each other to be exactly who they are. And when you become that woman, when you embody that level of understanding and acceptance, you don't just solve the bedroom problem. You transform the entire relationship into something most couples never experience. A partnership where both people feel safe enough to be completely seen and loved not despite their humanity, but because of it.